Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Mythical Madness at the Paris Olympics. Dionysus and Papa Smurf. Greek art and Greek tragedy above all held the destruction of myth at bay. Is there a pessimism of strength, an intellectual inclination for what in existence is hard, dreadful, evil, problematic, emerging from what is healthy, from overflowing well-being, from living existence to the full? Is there perhaps a way of suffering from the very fullness of life? A tempting courage of the keenest sight which demands what is terrible as the enemy, the worthy enemy, against which it can test its power, from which it wants to learn what to fear means? Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy. Well, this is what we're going to be looking at today, or at least a visual representation, and I'm going to split it into two parts in the sense that in a future video I'm going to look at the Leonardo da Vinci connotations of this tableau, and I think that was the main reaction from the public at the time of the 2024 Paris Olympics. This was associated with many people as a pastiche of the Da Vinci image, and for lots of people an affront to Christianity. So that I'd like to discuss on a separate occasion, just to make this a self-contained video about the little blue guy in the middle, who, as we'll see throughout the video, is supposed to be representing Dionysus, the Greek god of excess and intoxication and revelry and drunkenness. And I'd like to discuss how appropriate he is as a representation of what supposedly the Olympic Organising Committee and the director of the opening ceremony claimed how they were using him. And I think the claims for what Dionysus here was supposed to represent are fascinating, because they tell us, I think, a lot about the extent to which our present-day culture misunderstands and misuses myth. And that opens a whole question of the importance of myth and what happens when it's lost and it isn't understood in its original form. So again, at a future day, I'd love to explore the notion of myth as a type of ideology. So the French writer Roland Barthes talks of myth as what goes without saying. And for the ancient Greeks, myth was a way of codifying their beliefs about the world. And that arguably is what ideology does. And what is interesting to me is when we begin to misunderstand or become illiterate and about the true meaning and purpose of the original Greek myths, I think it makes us much less able to be reflective about our own ideologies and the myths that dominate our society today. So that's the overall argument I'm going to be pursuing, so we'll see how successful at that I am. And this is Dionysus stroke Papa Smurf and his bacchanalian crew in the background. And here, better lit, bit of glitter going on, with a cheeky little winky grin. Now looking slightly bemused, nonplussed in his budgie smugglers, speedos, whatever you'd like to call them. And just to give you some basic, I hope the contrast between me and him isn't too jarring. This is the actual French entertainer, comedian, singer, actor who was behind the blue paint. and he's Phillipe Katerine, and one of his famous songs was Luxor J'adore, which I do encourage you to go on YouTube and check out. I'll put the link in the description. But we're going to be discussing the notion of Dionysus and what it represents. But in the background, you can see the video was filmed in obviously a real French village, and the extras or the village inhabitants are very enthusiastic participants. And I just found it a very funny video, partly because it's a uniquely French sense of humour, I think. So it's interesting to see a completely different culture's humour. And then they're just little things. So he comes in on the back of a truck, and his backup singer stroke dancers are quite truculent looking women who have attitude, and they just remind me of, it's a dated reference, apologies, but if any of you are familiar with the Popular Beat combo band from the UK in the 80s and I think late 70s, but Human League, it reminded me of the backup singers from them. I hope that hasn't ruined it for you. It's just a very funny, at one point he surfs across the heads of the crowd wearing a overcoat and some Purcell white Y-fronts. It's any verbal description I could attempt to provide will not do it justice, so please do check it out. But I give you all this information because I just wanted to give you some context to the person who was behind Papa Smurf as depicted in the Paris Olympics. And to give you further example, I like to mix it up in terms of the references I give. So this is from a contributor on Reddit, and I have no reason to believe they're inaccurate. I just found it quite a useful insight. So this was the title of their contribution on the thread about the opening ceremonies and what's behind the Smurf character. So to French people, Phillipe Katerine is a national treasure. He's a singer, actor, and comedian. He wrote the song he sang during the opening ceremonies as a critique of violence among humans. Yeah, the song he was actually singing, I'm trying to remember the lyrics, but it was all about nudity, and if everyone was nude, then there wouldn't be as much violence, and you couldn't even handle it, you couldn't even hide a gun. Yeah, I think what part of the lyrics are, I know what you're thinking, but that's not a very good place to hide the gun. And again, very French sense of humour. And he did, I think there's a video of, is it manger ma banane? I'm pretty sure it means eat my banana, which involved loads of the French public acting as extras on a beach, waving bananas. And at one point, like the god Dionysus, he frolics, luckily mostly hidden by shadow, but there's jiggly stuff going on that is quite disturbing. The concept behind his performance celebrates joie de vivre, light-heartedness, beauty and joy in natural things and the natural world. He is portrayed as Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and celebration, and he is painted blue to represent Earth, the blue planet, and perhaps also as a reference to the Smurfs. For Americans, imagine Robin Williams dressed as a giant carrot, singing "Give Peas a Chance," and you'll be somewhere in the vicinity of how Katerine's performance landed with French audiences. And then I just love the fake, well not fake, but the academic almost annotations and additional notes you can get on Reddit sometimes. So it was pointed out by another contributor that the Smurfs was created by Peyo, a French-speaking Belgian comic artist. So the Smurf reference is probably deliberate. So this is the Olympic opening ceremony director Thomas Joly speaking to French TV. I think it was pretty clear. Well, I'm not so sure, Thomas. Millions of people really didn't know what was going on. There's Dionysus arriving at the table. Why is he there? Because he's the god of feasting, of wine, and the father of Sequana, the goddess of the river Seine. Yeah, I'm sure most people didn't know that, Thomas. And this is a great... I found this article that summarises the difference, and it's a crucial difference between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So Apollo was the Olympian deity of light, sculpture, and any dreamy, celestial raised art form. A lucid dream, one in which the dreamer knows they're dreaming but wants to go on living in it, is a paradigm of Apollonian pleasure. We know it is unreal, and the frontiers of reality are clearly signposted, but it still provides an ordered, desirable experience. And I love this aspect of it because the notion of a paradigm of Apollonian pleasure, it's also a paradigm of what online communications is like. Increasingly, people spend more and more of their life in what in previous videos I've described as an online labyrinth. But it's like a lucid dream. You know it's not real, but nevertheless, you immerse yourself in it. So that's, in some sense, the Apollonian, which can be contrasted with the Dionysian. So whilst the Apollonian belongs to the individual, the Dionysian draws the individual closer to the muddied ground of unified human experience. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine, revelry, and unbridled passion, the earthbound ecstasies. According to Nietzsche, the Dionysian artistic impulse is best understood through an analogy to intoxication, either under the influence of alcohol or other fertile terrestrial delights, such as dancing or the onset of spring. So the contrast between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, as I say, it makes me think of the extent to which, in an online, increasingly Apollonian environment, we've lost touch with the Dionysian. And this, I think, is Nietzsche, but obviously well before the onset of the online environment. Nietzsche was bemoaning the fact that with Greek tragedy, you had this unique art form that managed to combine the Apollonian. So there would be brilliant artistic dialogue and there would be beautiful ethereal singing from the chorus of the tragedies. But also horrible, dark, violent things were also being represented. Dionysian urges were being represented in the tragedies. People met grisly ends. So Nietzsche argued that the Greek tragic art form managed to combine, arguably like no art form before or after has ever managed, uniquely a brilliant balance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And the idea of a ground, the muddied ground of unified human experience, I'd suggest if, for example, you're not religious, some religious people would get this communal experience from going to a church or temple and celebrating together as a community of faith. Non-religious people, I'm guessing, if you're young, obviously, you go to music events and you get this Dionysian intoxicated effect. But older people, I guess, one of the only ways you get it is from huge sporting events, being in a massive crowd, as one, all swaying and singing the same song or supporting your team in incredibly dramatic sporting moments. But especially, you know, obviously with the advent of lockdown and the ever more ubiquitous prevalence of online social media type environments, there's a strong argument to suggest we've lost touch with these earthbound ecstasies. Everything's become more ethereal, less earthbound, and arguably more Apollonian. But to give some context for the whole notion of Dionysus, and then I will go back to the specific use of Dionysus in the Paris Olympics. So this is, I believe, a top of a cosmetics lid, a cosmetics jar lid. And it looks a relatively inoffensive image. You've got the quite stern-looking women. And in the middle is a king called Pentheus. And I want to give you a set of quotations from the play by Euripides called The Bacchae. And they're also known as the Maenads, or they were the, mostly, as far as I know, female followers of Dionysus. And at least mythically, and it's an interesting question whether in reality it ever happened, but mythically at least, that they had a reputation for getting into such a frenzy. They would have superhuman strength, and they would rip people or animals apart with their bare hands. And in the story of the play, The Bacchae by Euripides, I won't give you the full details, but Pentheus is the king who rejects Dionysus. But he wants to see one of the allegedly frenzied orgies that the female followers engage in. So he hides in a tree, and it's interesting, they make him cross-dress almost to humiliate him, but there's quite gender-blending themes going on that's interesting for such an early play with relevance to today. And the quote I'm going to read you is, he falls out of the tree, he's shaken, he gives himself away, and he's shaken from the tree. And Ino and Agave basically pull him apart limb from limb with other Maenads. So what seems to be a relatively, quite beautiful image, it goes to the very first quotation I used from Nietzsche at the beginning of the video. The willingness of the Greeks to confront the abyss of darkness, the way they embraced pessimism and drew strength from things that perhaps they should fear. So this is from The Birth of Tragedy. And psychologically speaking, what then is the meaning of that madness out of which tragic as well as comic art grew, the Dionysian madness? What? Is madness perhaps not necessarily the symptom of degradation, of collapse, of cultural decadence? Are there perhaps, a question for doctors who treat madness, neuroses associated with health, with the youth of a people and with youthfulness? What is revealed in that synthesis of God and goat in the satyr? Out of what personal experience, what impulse did the Greeks have to imagine the Dionysian enthusiast, an original man, as a satyr? And then I hope he's not offended, but this always reminds me of my good friend Richard Grannon. If he was nodding his head and leering. So again from Birth of Tragedy, and so far as the origin of the tragic chorus is concerned, in those centuries when the Greek body flourished and the Greek soul bubbled over with life, were there perhaps endemic raptures, visions and hallucinations which entire communities, entire cultural bodies shared? How's that? What if it were the case that the Greeks, right in the richness of their youth, had the will for the tragic and were pessimists? What if it was clearly lunacy, to use a saying from Plato, which brought the greatest blessings throughout Greece? So this is part of Nietzsche's overall argument in The Birth of Tragedy, that potentially we've lost in our culture the way that Greek tragedy was able to sublimate the madness and intoxication and frenzy elements of the human experience. And obviously after Nietzsche, the rise of the Apollonian, the abstract, the light-based part of the human experience, the non-earthbound, cyberspatial aspect of life has grown and grown and grown, arguably at the expense of what Nietzsche's talking about here. And it's interesting, in an era when mental health has become ubiquitously discussed and for some people fetishized, Nietzsche suggesting that the Greeks had found a way to channel it somehow much better, and that coincided with the golden age of Greek culture. So to bring some of these ideas together, what I want to do now is just very briefly introduce this notion of the Bacchae, the play by Euripides. So I think he died and then it premiered shortly after his death in 405 BC. And there are various aspects to it. So the Maenads, like the Bacchae, the title Bacchae refers to, it's the same thing, the Maenads, the followers who got into frenzies, the followers of the cult of Dionysus. And then you have part of the backstory, Dionysus himself. His mother was Semele, and she had an affair with Zeus. And Hera was jealous of this affair and tricked Semele into asking Zeus to demonstrate his power, after first making him promise whatever she asked for he would grant. And if I've remembered it correctly, she is then killed by a lightning bolt, a thunderbolt from the hand of Zeus, because he shows her his power. And the unborn child is gestated in the thigh of Zeus. I'll give you a disturbing image of that in a second, just to forewarn you. So it's the darkness, this notion of the pessimism of the Greek mindset that they welcomed and dealt with. There are dark, dark themes. As if to illustrate this, sparagmos, this tearing apart, which is a theme in the Bacchae, the tearing apart live animals or people. Homophagia, the eating of raw flesh. Cheery, cheery stuff. And if you want a modern example, there's a brilliant novel, I think it was published 1924 by Thomas Mann. And it's a great novel about the decline of Western culture, described through the metaphor of a sanatorium in the Alps for people suffering from TB. And the protagonist, Hans Castorp, is at the sanatorium. I think he goes to visit a friend and then ends up, he's got TB himself and stays there. Apologies if I've misremembered, ages since I've read it. But there's a chapter called Snow that gives a very alarming, I'm warning you, it is quite upsetting. But if you're interested in how Thomas Mann interpreted this cult of Dionysus, and arguably the dark cult that was at the heart of the origins of Western culture in ancient Greece, Hans Castorp falls asleep he's sheltering behind an outbuilding in the middle. He gets caught while skiing in a blizzard. And because he's weak and tired and cold, he falls asleep in the blizzard and has this horrible vision that draws upon the notion of the myth of the Dionysian cult. So check that out in your own time. I don't want to get taken off YouTube for reading it out. But I did say I'd show you a representation of the idea of Dionysus being gestated in the thigh of Zeus. And then what I'm going to do now is read a relatively short section from the Bacchae by Euripides and intersperse it with some just representations of Dionysus that have occurred over the centuries, just to break up the text. So this is, I think it's line 1110 or something of the play The Bacchae by Euripides. Hands without number grasped the tree and felled it. From high aloft, high up and down to the ground he fell with desperate, infinite cries of loss. So Pentheus was hiding in the tree and he's discovered. Pentheus, he knew the end was near. His mother, priestess of the sacrifice, was first to fall upon him. He hoped to show her who he was. He ripped his headband off to stop her killing him. Poor, poor Ugavi. He's wearing a headband because it's all part of the story, but he's made to dress as a woman to disguise himself. Touching her cheek, "Mother," he said, "I am your child, Pentheus, son of Echion. Mother, pity me. Don't kill me, mother. I made mistakes, but I am still your child." So this, remember all these images of artistic representations of Dionysus over time. But she was foaming at the mouth, her eyes rolled all around, her mind was mindless now. Held by the god, she paid the man no heed. He grabbed his left arm just below the elbow. Wedging her foot against the victim's ribs, she ripped his shoulder off. Not by mere force, the god made easy everything they touched. On his right arm worked Ino, ripping flesh. Autonoe and the mob of Maenads gripped him, screaming as one. While he had breath, he cried, but they were whooping victory calls. One took an arm, a foot another, boot and all. They stripped his torso bare, staining their nails with blood, then tossed the balls of flesh around. Pentheus's body lies in fragments now, on the hard rocks and mingled with the leaves, buried in woodland, hard to find. His mother stumbled across his head. Poor head. She grabbed it and fixed it on her thyrsus like a lion's, to wave in joyful triumph at her hunt. Sad triumph. She ran all across the mountain, down through Cytheron, leaving her sisters dancing with Maenads. It's like looking in the mirror each morning. So again, Rose Thompson. Humans desire a myth that coexists with our reality in order to make the latter bearable and to help us navigate it. Nietzsche believed that Greek tragedy was in a class of its own in this respect, because in it the myth is revealed rather than veiled as it is in some religions and Greek mystery cults. Nietzsche also here discloses the origin of a rapture that yields a sense of purpose. For Nietzsche, tragedy is the equivalent of staring nihilism in the face, except instead of turning away from life, one pours one's existential dread into an artistic medium. Tragedy provides a metaphysical consolation and a catharsis. It provides a myth for myth's sake that is not met with cynicism, but rather with a sobering willingness to entertain it for what it is. It is a necessary illusion that transfigures the sharpest edged reality into something more, even something beautiful. And this is a painting by, again, of Dionysus and the entourage. And I think it's 1889. And I saw an Alma, I was lucky enough to see an Alma Tadema exhibition in Liverpool many years ago. And he was very famous, irrespective of the content. If you notice, you'll never get, it's one of these, paintings that I say, and other people have said to me, you really need to see this particular painting in the flesh. If that's not an unfortunate turn of phrase after what I've just been reading. But he was famous for the way he managed to paint marble and get paint. It was almost, I remember the paintings, it looked like you could touch them and they were marble. Amazing use of light and reflected light. And you obviously just don't get it from a reproduction. Because for lots of people, Alma Tadema, it's quite kitschy. But if you're a marble fetishist, it's truly stunning, stunning work. So what is the meaning of this myth? Once criticism started pouring in, Olympic officials gave a variety of interpretations of Dionysus and the drag tableau. The official Olympics X account wrote that the interpretation of the Greek god Dionysus makes us aware of the absurdity of violence between human beings. Really? I wanted you to see this because this is the official explanation of why they showed it. So now I hope you get my point why I'm not talking about the Leonardo da Vinci confusion, because that's another level of confusion. This is about the organisers of the Olympics thinking they were using the god Dionysus to represent non-violence. And if you've paid any attention to the Euripides quotations, Dionysus and his followers were not really good poster children for the concept of non-violence. And my suggestion is it takes a Herculean illiteracy and lack of knowledge of the Greek myths to honestly think this is what Dionysus represented. And that, I hope, should make you question the extent to which our current culture has completely lost touch with some of its own cultural resources. Thomas Joly, the director of the opening ceremony, said that the idea was to do a big pagan party linked to the gods of Olympus. I wanted a ceremony that brings people together, that reconciles. Anne de Camp, a spokesperson for the Olympic Games, said, I think we tried to celebrate community, tolerance. We believe this ambition was achieved. I love the idea that I wanted a ceremony that brings people together, that reconciles. I can't think of an instance where someone is less brought together than Pentheus being ripped limb from limb. But remember, in the current era we live in, the celebration of community and tolerance. And simultaneously, so it's the demented, endless ideological reference to community, tolerance, diversity, all these issues. And then the simultaneous belief that these things have been achieved by actions in this particular case, the use of Dionysus as a role model or a reference point, which has the exact opposite effect of what Madame Anne here has completely misunderstood. But if you're that ignorant of Greek myths, your lack of understanding is no hindrance to the claims you can make of your achievements. But bring all this to an end, and what I wanted to do was, again, possibly for a future video, there's this beautiful essay, long essay, by Etienne de la Boétie. Discourse of, I love the phrase, voluntary servitude, because it makes me think of the way in which in our contemporary era, it's the cliched comparison of George Orwell's 94 with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. The point being, in Brave New World, you don't have to be dominated ideologically or punished as Winston Smith is in Orwell's 1984. The point is, in a modern society saturated with media technologies, we connive at our own oppression. Or this concept of voluntary servitude. So I think the following quotation, I would ask you, remember it's written in 1576, but I think it aptly describes the type of cultural and social context that's being created that would explain the mindset of someone who thinks they're using Dionysus as a representation of non-violence. So do not imagine that there is any bird more easily caught by decoy, nor any fish sooner fixed on the hook by wormy bait, than are all these poor fools neatly tricked into servitude by the slightest feather passed, so to speak, before their mouths. Truly, it is a marvellous thing that they let themselves be caught so quickly at the slightest tickling of their fancy. Plays, farces, spectacles, gladiators, strange beasts, medals, pictures, and other such opiates. These were for ancient peoples the bait towards slavery, the price of their liberty, the instruments of tyranny. By these practices and enticements, the ancient dictators so successfully lulled their subjects under the yoke that the stupefied peoples, fascinated by the pastimes and vain pleasures flashed before their eyes, learned subservience as naively, but not so creditably, as little children learn to read by looking at bright picture books. I just think it's from 1576. What a brilliant description of online addiction or obsession with images. So I want to finish with some images from, it's a slightly dated advert, but I just think I would suggest it's a contemporary version in a different way of Dionysus than was used in the Paris Olympics. But I think the example I'm going to give you now of Johnny Depp as a Dionysus-type figure illustrates this beautiful quote and the notion of voluntary servitude, what we do to ourselves because we've become so fixated and addicted to this tsunami of images that overwhelms our lives. And unlike the way Nietzsche talks about Greek tragedy as being a healthy way to deal with dark forces, the way modernity, our contemporary world, deals with these dark forces is in a really kitschy, unimpressive, non-sublimated way. And that begs the question, well, what happens when you lose touch with the power and the profound insights that the Greek myths had? There's no ability to channel in a cultural form the tight balance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, we've given ourselves over to a fake form of the Dionysian. We've turned Dionysus into Papa Smurf, or in this case, a very confused Johnny Depp. So I don't know if any of you remember this. My guilty pleasure is I'm obsessed with perfume or aftershave adverts because I honestly believe they encapsulate in a really odd way the absolute insanity. Talk about Dionysian madness. But they encapsulate in a uniquely profound way the underlying lack of logic to advertising and the general climate of all these images. So, you know, if you listen, I'm not sure they're designed to be listened to or analysed, but the soundtrack or the script to some of these perfume or aftershave adverts, you know, I don't know where I begin and you end, and be all that you can be, and just the absolute tautological tosh that these adverts involve, I think, it's just a sad parody of, like I said, an art form like Greek tragedy. But this is Johnny Depp going off into I'm assuming it's the Arizona or Nevada type desert, and you never leave home without a shovel. And he does what any member of a contemporary Dionysian cult does. He goes off to bury his extensive jewellery collection. So I'll just leave you with, I think it's very illustrative and revealing reinterpretation of the savagery that I described in Euripides. The savagery of the followers of Dionysus in our culture has been turned into Papa Smurf, or the following image, which I think sums it up in an imagistic way. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Like I say, I'll follow up with something on the Leonardo da Vinci connotations of the Papa Smurf tableau on another day. But till the next time, all the very best. I'll finish with this savage image. Sauvage pour l'homme.